So Canada just lost Gord Downie. Obviously, people know his work from the Tragically Hip, but he was also very involved in a lot of other issues. And just in his last part of his life, he's decided to make a very serious commitment to raising the profile of Canada's serious Indigenous reconciliation problem. And I myself, just independently of this, over the past, I guess, 5 years or so, I've been very slowly starting to get an understanding of Indigenous issues and how things work in the many countless cultures that exist here. And somebody invited me last year to a powwow, and I'd never been to a powwow before, and I didn't really know anything about it, and so I attended it. And there was an elder there who spoke his own language. He didn't speak a word of English, and so he had somebody there that could translate for him. And he gave this little story. He said, if your house burns down, that's okay, because you can rebuild it. It's just a house, and as long as you're okay, then it's fine. You can rebuild it. But if you lose your water, if the village loses its water supply, if there's no more water, then the village dies. If the water is poisoned, then the village dies. And I heard that, and I was like, wow. So, and as the interpreter was saying, like, this is a story that's been passed on, obviously, for generations and generations. And something I'm slowly learning about First Nations traditions is that things get passed down orally. There is an astonishing amount, like an astonishing quality, but also quantity of information that's available. So when I heard that, my mind immediately went to the nuclear issue, because I thought about how Mark Matson was talking. And Mark Matson, by the way, he was a good close friend of Gord Downie. And he talked about the effect that these nuclear power plants are having on the Great Lakes. So obviously Gord Downie would have been well aware of it. And that got me, I'm just some random IT person. And that got me thinking, well, what else don't I know about nuclear Ontario? And again, I don't want to be sounding like I'm capitalizing on his loss, but like, this was one of his own personal causes. And so in my mind, I see that as, I should actually say that just so it's clear. I want to be clear. I'm not trying to, use Gord Downie's passing to get into this. I just want people to know that this was one of his own personal passions. He really, truly cared about getting a swimmable, drinkable, fishable Lake Ontario. And he was a member, he was on the board of directors of Lake Ontario Waterkeeper, an organization I have a tremendous amount of respect for. And so I'm really not trying to do this to raise attention to any of my own causes. For that issue alone, it's really just about the water issue. But while you're thinking about it, just think about, what else don't I know? What else can I do? Can I learn to try to ensure that the nature, the water, our people, Indigenous people here in Canada, are getting the attention that they deserve, that they have a right to, that never should have been taken away from them. And please start taking a look at those issues. Gord Downie was aware of these. They were important to him. I think they should be important to everybody. You're listening to TMI for the week of October 30th, 2017.
Today on TMI, Dave sits down with AJ again, the IT professional from Ontario, to talk about the problems of the nuclear industry and how little people know about nuclear.
My own profession, I'm an IT professional. So far I've been talking about things where I'm learning from the experts, or I'm trying to form my own opinions. But now I'm going to get into some stuff where I actually do have some knowledge, where I actually do have some expertise. people have been paying me for my IT skills since 1994. Back then, I wanted to be a scientist. Looking into data and big complex things, making sense out of it, and making discoveries based on the data and like, everything. I'm a nerd, so to me it was really fascinating. But then 1994, somebody paid me for my IT skills, and so I'm like, maybe I'll start using my IT knowledge in some way. Maybe we can make some money out of that. And then in 2002, I started focusing my energy, my efficiency on mission critical systems. I decided, okay, well, I don't want to deal with, like, as I would call it, video games. Like, there's people who see their computers almost like a toy and something that's not really important, and it didn't interest me. I want to make something that's actually reliable, something that has to be reliable. And for a while, my first job was service manager of a computer store, and you would learn very easily, very quickly about the hardware side. People would bring your machine in, and it's like, oh, great, they're using that really cheap, crummy brand of hard drive. Of course that thing's going to fail. No surprise. In fact, who sold it to them? We sold it to them? Why did we sell that horrible thing? And so I learned, like, what parts, what brands are better, how to better take care of it. But then the part that would irk me endlessly was the software side. Because, worst case scenario with hardware is you have like a motherboard type of a failure. So suddenly you're having to replace power supply or motherboard. So if you have to take out the motherboard, that's going to be the most time that you're going to spend on a hardware failure. You're going to have to take out probably the CPU, the RAM, disconnect all the components, all the case connectors, unscrew it from the back of the case. Like, all of those things you have to do to replace a motherboard. And that was like one of the most common components that would fail. And so the solution obviously would be to buy better motherboards, don't buy the cheap ones. So you can get rid of those issues very quickly. But then if you have to replace a hard drive, it's just physically replacing the hard drive is super easy normally in a typical computer case. But with a software issue, it's absolutely not uncommon for it to just take hours of your life to deal with whatever that issue is. And I started off with Windows. Actually, well, personally, I started off with DOS, but you would get into Windows. And so all these people were bringing Microsoft Windows computers into the service department, and you're having to deal with it. And it was very frustrating because all those things that you can do with hardware just don't use that component, use this component instead. Don't use that brand, use this brand. You don't have with Windows. Windows is the brand. Windows is the component. And it was getting viruses and spyware and junk and just all this awful stuff. And there were problems that I could see. And I mean, I'm a programmer as well. In fact, that most of what I do nowadays is actually programming. But these days, most programs are typically in the many kilobytes to megabytes range. So suddenly you're looking at orders of magnitude more ones and zeros. It is just not possible for a human to process it. So where do these ones and zeros come from? That comes from something called source code. Source code is what a human programmer wrote. So a human programmer took the time to write instructions for a computer to process. So where I have a concern with the Windows operating system, it's a closed source operating system. So Windows is a closed source. You don't have access to that source code. So when I was a service manager and dealing with Windows problems, I would come up on a Windows problem. I would say, this is a problem in the software. I know I can see how this is being written. I can see what's happening on the screen, but I don't have access to that code. Therefore, I can't fix it. All I have is this gigantic binary blob. The only company in the world that has access to the source code is Microsoft. Only Microsoft has access to that binary blob. I can't fix this problem. So I know that this virus comes in the same way every time. I know how to fix it, but I can't because I don't have access to the source code. So I found it extremely frustrating, and I said, okay, I can't take this anymore. I'm not going to tolerate this anymore. I need an alternative. Anyway, what I wanted to get into was being able to fix the problems that the company won't. Because if I was to report almost any one of these bugs to Microsoft, they're not going to do anything. They're not going to fix it. They don't care. it was created by the military. Let's be honest. Oh, in this case, it was made by some big corporations, but heavily funded by the military. Unix was what they used for their back end because that was designed to be a reliable multi-user system, and you have access to the source code. And it still is very much around to this day. Like all 13 of the internet root servers, I believe, are still using Unix type software on it. So it's very powerful, reliable stuff that can be used to do big, amazing things. And we now have the internet in this big way that we have it today. It is the most complex thing on the planet. And the internet is powered by open source software. So open source software means that you have access to the source code. So it means you have access to the code that was used to make the binaries that gives you the programs that you use. If you have a problem with the program that you're using, you can't fix the binary, but you can fix the source code and then make a new binary from that fixed source code. And now you have your fixed program. And closed source would be like where you don't have access to the source code. So that's your Microsoft Windows, that's your Apple Mac OS, and your other closed source operating systems. And so there's all kinds of different options, and they're all very reliable. The military uses them quite extensively because they wanted a reliable system. They don't want people to be able to hack into their cruise missiles that they're trying to use to destroy other countries. So the U.S. military uses it very extensively. Like any serious military or government or space agency or whatever, they're going to be using Unix very, very, very extensively.
I mean, where you're leading with this is if I understand what you've said in the past, is that open source for mission critical institutions like maybe even nuclear power plants.
Mm-hmm. The advantages of having the source code, there are actually security advantages of having access to the source code. So one is you can fix something yourself. So, and that's an extremely important thing that a lot of people take for granted, is that with these closed source systems, you can't fix it yourself. So if something goes wrong, you can't fix it yourself. You have to wait for the person with the source code to help you, if they're even able to help you at all. Sometimes companies go to business, sometimes people die, sometimes they lose the source code. Like there's all these scenarios that comes up where you're just simply not able to fix what could be a very serious, devastating problem. The next aspect of that is you will have people looking at it, just wide open to the general public for everybody to take a look at this code and to see what does it look like, is there anything wrong with it, yes or no, and then this stuff typically will get fixed if somebody will find a problem with it. There's a common saying that given enough eyes, all bugs are shallow, and so the idea is that if you're looking at a big sea of information, then if enough people are looking at it, then any bug will not be as deep as you think it is. It's some little thing that anybody can look at. Just give enough eyes, all bugs are shallow is the phrase that you often see in open source communities. So you can modify it in all kinds of ways. You can use a different compiler. There's so much you can do to make it very difficult for somebody to try to exploit one of these vulnerabilities. But one commonality that you have to, like one thing that I know from my own experience is that we don't really we don't consider probability with software. Like the exception is with some encryption algorithms, because there you're definitely looking at probability. You want to know that, what are the chances of somebody guessing this random number? And you want it to be some stupidly, ridiculously high number where it will take hundreds of thousands of years at 1,000 guesses per second to try to guess the correct combination. So those are like brute force type scenarios. You're typically looking for another way to get in, but it's those other ways. And this is something that irks me with the nuclear industry, because they look at all these probability things, and in my industry we don't look at probability. If we think that there's any probability, we consider that we don't look at probability, we look at possibility. Possibility is what we look at, because if something is possible, it's going to happen. If there's any probability, we have to assume it's going to happen. So we have to implement safeguards against that to ensure that it doesn't happen. But the main things are reliability. For reliability, you should definitely not be using Windows. For security, you should absolutely not be using Windows, because you don't know what it's doing under the hood. It's closed source software. You don't know what's in that source code. And so therefore, you absolutely don't know what's in that binary that you're running on your computer. It can be doing anything under the hood. And look at how often Windows vulnerabilities come out. It's all the time. I got a good feel about how my job works and blah blah blah. And then suddenly I start wondering about I see that video. I was there for the talk. I saw the talk by Lake Ontario Waterkeepers Mark Matson at Metro Hall in 2012, and he's talking about what they're dumping into our water. And I was wondering, well, what else don't I know? And so I'm thinking, well, I know a bunch of people that work at Pickering and Darlington. I'm going to start asking some questions. And so, I'm asking them these questions, and they're like, oh, yeah, we do that. And I'm like, wait, what? Well, hold on. I mentioned something about Windows to one of them, and he's like, oh, yeah, well, we use that at work. I'm like, no, because you're running a nuclear power plant. You don't run Microsoft Windows in a nuclear power plant. And he's like, oh, yeah, we do. I'm like, no, that's not responsible. Like, NASA wouldn't do that. The military wouldn't do that. My customers, and I mean, most of my customers are like small to medium-sized businesses. Like for my own, like I know like families that won't do that for their own family personal usage. They won't use Microsoft Windows because I hate it. It's like, no, you can't use that in a nuclear power plant. Don't you realize how wrong that is? And I'm talking to these people, and it's very clear. Like, all of their training is in nuclear. They are not IT professionals. They know really nothing about IT. And I'm trying to explain it to them, and it's, how do I get you to understand that this is a very serious issue? Can you get your managers to fix this problem? Because you shouldn't be doing this. This is very, very dangerous. And so they would try to talk to the managers, and the managers would say, it's like, yeah, AJ, it's probably fine. We haven't really had a nuclear disaster caused by any of these, and so yeah, it's probably fine. And I'm like, okay, no, this is totally not acceptable. And then I found out that there was the 2012 CNSE hearing coming up, and as this is coming up, I thought, okay, well, I think I should do an intervention, because this is a serious problem. You should not be using Microsoft Windows in a nuclear power plant. That is so dangerous from a reliability perspective, from a safety perspective, from a security perspective. You should not be doing this. How do you maintain it? Like, how do you maintain a system where you don't have access to the source code? This is so dangerous. And then and I'm also learning, because now, Mark Matson, Lake Ontario Waterkeeper just opened my mind. Like, what else I don't know? I'm trying to suck in all of this knowledge. I'm looking at the economics of it. I'm looking at the safety. I'm looking at the contamination, about the health impacts. There's all these things of which I have no expertise, but I'm trying to learn. And it's all very scary to me. So I go to that first hearing, and I bring up, and actually the funny thing is that before I went to that first hearing, you first have to submit your intervention. You have to write out your intervention and submit it to them weeks in advance. And so weeks in advance, I sent them a copy of what I was going to present at the hearing. And I think I did on a weekend, if I remember correctly. But then on first thing on Monday morning at 6 a.m., I get a call from CNSE's Louise Levere. And I actually have a tremendous amount of respect for her. She does really good work as CNSE's interventions coordinator, or whatever her title is.
It's like a public liaison. So.
Yeah, she really goes out of her way to ensure that the public gets the information that they need to go to these hearings and to participate, and she does a very good job. So while I often lambast CNSE about various things, she's definitely one of the exceptions. She's very good. She contacts me and she says, I got it through email. I can't read your email because it's encrypted. I'm like, well, that's not even possible because I don't have your encryption key. I can't send you an encrypted email message. Unless I'm doing it with some other key, but I don't have your key. And she's like, but it says it's encrypted. And I look at my message and I'm like, no, it's very definitely not encrypted. It's digitally signed. And she's like, no, my program says it's encrypted. I'm like, no. Do you have an IT department I can talk to? And she says, yeah, I'll put you through. And so she puts me through to CNSE's IT department. And I said, yeah, so Louise is trying to open up my email message, and it says that my message is encrypted. And the guy says, oh, well, can you send it to me? I said, sure, I'll send it right now. I send it over. And he's like, oh, yeah, it's definitely encrypted. What? No, it's not encrypted. What? Why does it say that it's encrypted? And I'm like, wait, what program are you using? And he's like, oh, we're using Microsoft Outlook, of course. I'm like, no, don't use that program. And he's like, why not? And I'm like, well, back in 2005, because I started phasing out my Microsoft support back in 2002. In 2005, I had 2 companies that were using Microsoft Outlook. And the way that Microsoft Outlook works is that it stores all of your priceless, one-of-a-kind, irreplaceable data in a PST file. It's this proprietary, binary, awful file. And if it gets corrupted, if you lose it, it's gone. You are totally... And everybody should always have backups. I stress that to everyone. You should always have backups. But these awful PST files, they often get corrupted, and you lose everything inside. I had 2 companies that risked going out of business because they were storing all of their data in these stupid Microsoft Outlook programs. So all of their contacts information, all of their email correspondence, all of their calendars, all of their appointments, everything from years was suddenly gone forever. They were like, do we lose our business now? And they didn't have backups. No, and this is a running gag in our industry, at least in system administration, is that the rule of backups is people don't do backups. You have to do everything you can to impose it on them, just automatic backups. And I'm at the point now where all of my good customers are doing it, but you still get people where no matter how hard you try, they don't do backups. But anyway, and then you have to tell them why it's a tragedy that they've lost their data and why you can't get it back unless they want to spend an inordinate sum of money on a data recovery lab. Anyway, little rant, but it gives you a sense of what I'm dealing with here with these CNSC people. So so he's saying that he's using Microsoft Outlook. I'm like, okay, so obviously there's a bug. Obviously there's a bug in Microsoft Outlook that looks at a digitally signed message and treats it as a digitally encrypted message. They could not open this message, and they would not cooperate with me trying to get it open, and it was very frustrating. So eventually, I got a call back from Louise. She said, we have a fix now. I'm like, oh, great. I'm like, what's the fix? And she's like, we have purchased an extremely expensive encryption add-on for Microsoft Outlook. I'm like, you didn't have to do that. I was telling you how you could have done this for free. I'm not trying to scam. I'm not making any money. I'm not making money on this. I just want you guys to work better. Like, how many other interveners have you had this problem with? And she's like, you're actually the only person that's ever sent me a digitally signed message. And at the time, now since then, I'm sure more people are doing it, but at the time, it wasn't apparently as common. And it was very frustrating. And then I get to this hearing, and it's my first hearing, and I'm thinking, okay, I talked about the importance of using open source software in mission critical environments and why it's so dangerous to use Microsoft Windows and closed source software. And they've had weeks to review that. They had weeks for all their experts to go over that. And I get there to the hearing, and so therefore I thought, okay, I'm just going to just rhyme off my every little topic that I wrote about in my however many pages worth of written intervention. And I did it very quickly, and about all these very disparate issues. So I talked about like the economics, I talked about health and safety and radiation exposure and what other countries are doing. I talked about all these things that have nothing to do with software. And I mentioned the software thing only very briefly because I assumed that not years, but weeks and months to analyze this written intervention. They've all gone over it. So I'm just going to make sure that I say all the things I want to talk about. And this is before I knew that CNSC does not have a mandate to review the economics or anything else. So I do this thing. And then Binder responds to my presentation by saying, very entertaining. And I'm like, what? Like, what were you referring to my intervention as entertaining? No, I have serious issues here. Why is that very entertaining? And he's like, does anybody, and then that's what I was thinking to myself. My internal monologue is like, what? And then Binder's like, okay, do we have any questions? And one of the CNSC commissioners says, well, what was that thing about digital signatures? You said, what was that about? And so I explained it. And then I'm like, I offered to help. I said, I'm not going to charge you for this. I'm just willing to offer my assistance for free for how you can fix this bug. And Binder's like, oh no, you're trying to break into our systems. I'm like, no, I'm trying to help you with an IT problem that your IT people won't have. What's wrong with? And he's bullying me at this point. He's being very obnoxious. And I'm just like, what's wrong with your IT department? Anyway, so and I called them on the phone. I called them back, and they wouldn't respond to my phone calls, my messages, and they wouldn't. Anyway, I
remember he was saying, "Oh no, we have IT people who are quite competent and can take care of that."
Yeah,
and they made you look like you were. He did make you look like you were trying to pull a fast one.
And really, I wasn't. Like, I was just trying to, because I knew like what they were doing is potentially going to cause them a huge problem with Microsoft Outlook, especially those stupid PSD files. And of course, they may have like their own internal thing, and maybe they do have backups, but still, like it's a dangerous program to use for a national nuclear regulator. Like, that's not what they should be using. That's the wrong tool for the job. You should be using something that is like military grade, like good, high quality, secure stuff where you have access to the code. The code has been third-party reviewed. It has been independently analyzed.
It would make sense that all of the computers and machinery should be military grade, not consumer grade.
Well,
and that there should be, a rule that you can't use something like Windows.
Yeah, and so there's a hardware side where, and they use different terms. They don't always say military grade. Sometimes they say enterprise grade or server grade or whatever. But the hardware is one side and the software is another side. The simplest, there's two pieces of software advice I give to all of my customers. One is always do backups, and two, always make sure that you have access to the source code, because I have never once walked into a company that was not screwed over in one way or another by their IT providers, and especially because of source code issues. In the 1980s, AECL made a radiation therapy machine called the Therac 25, THERAC-25. It was a radiation therapy machine, and it didn't have its source code independently reviewed before they started operating it on humans. So some programmer just wrote it. Like, yeah, I just wrote that. There you go. Now let's put that into this machine. And so they put all this, maybe they put all kinds of care into the hardware, but they totally disregarded the software. Practically totally disregarded the software. They didn't have it independently reviewed. Just somebody wrote it, said, there you go, you can use the software in your machine. And it had a bug. There was a flaw in this software where when they were basically cranking up the dial for what to do, whatever they had to do with these patients, where it wasn't giving accurate readings on the screen. The software wasn't interpreting the dial correctly. So because of this software bug, but the operator realized, well, if I just crank it up a little higher, then it would give the reading on the screen that they were expecting. But that was because of a software bug. This was not because of hardware. This was 100% a software bug. Because of the software bug, holes were literally blasted through patients' bodies. And this has been very heavily documented. And the group that analyzed this case, because people died. People literally died because of this machine. This machine literally killed people because of the software bug. They used this on humans, and the group, the commission, whatever it was that analyzed that case, said they should have had that source code independently reviewed by third-party experts before operating it on humans. That was the finding. That was the conclusion. So you would think that the nuclear industry in Canada would have learned. And the problem with software bugs is they can persist undetected for years. You can have years go by until the right conditions are in place for a software bug to manifest. And again, let me stress, these are not hardware problems, these are software problems. Like the hardware doesn't know how to do anything really other than process ones and zeros. It just has to be physically well-built components that process ones and zeros at the correct speed that you need for whatever your application is. That's really what it has to do. It has to do that. How you do that is very difficult and complicated, but that's what you have to do. It just has to be physically built really well. That's the job of the hardware. The software is where the intelligence comes in. So, and years can go by, and we had that in the case of Bruce Power. It had been running for years, and then in 1990, the conditions were met that triggered, because of a software bug at Bruce, that triggered a loss of coolant event. So think about that. A software bug at Bruce Nuclear Generating Station here in Ontario, Canada, caused a loss of coolant event, a software bug. You would have thought that they would have learned from the AECL tragedy of people being killed by a machine because of a software bug. You thought they would have learned. No, that bug persisted. They had a loss of coolant event. Now, it wasn't a big, epic, crazy disaster, but it was still a physically manifested problem caused by a software bug at a Canadian nuclear power plant. So, this is what we've seen so far. What else might exist? Well, we don't know. Why don't we know? Well, because the source code for these plants isn't available to the public. And in some cases, they are using very, very, very old hardware. And why are they using very, very old hardware? Because they don't know how to replace the software that is on it. So if you have access to the source code, you can basically do anything you want with the program. You can change it, you can modify it. If this source code was designed to work on old computers, you can modify the source code, and now it can be designed to work on new modern computers. There's all these things that you can do with the source code, but if all you have is the binary, you're stuck. This binary is good for this type of computer and this type of computer only. You probably can't make it work on something else.
That software is sold by a U.S. company, am I wrong?
There's multiple pieces of software that they use. Some of them is like off-the-shelf stuff that they use with Microsoft Windows, which I have frustration with. But there is in 1965 there was a computer called the PDP-8 that was released. It was made by a company called DEC, Digital Equipment Corporation, and it was what they called a mini computer. So there were like mainframes, and they had what they called mini computers, which were basically just like smaller mainframes. And mainframes were designed to be very reliable machines, and they still are. People still make mainframes to this day. They basically have total redundancy on everything. Everything they process at least twice to try to reduce the probability of a hardware error, but you still have the potential for a software error. You still have the potential that there could be a software issue in there. So you have to make sure that all of your software is really, 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 really carefully scrutinized. And the challenge of scrutinizing software is it's difficult because if all you have is a binary, it's basically useless to you. You have to have the source code. So you look at the source code. So, for example, a race condition it's an easier one to understand because it's where you try to have two things happening at the exact same time. So it's totally dependent on what other processes are running in the computer and what other potentially hardware things are happening. So maybe even depending on the speed of your hardware, you could have this one thing where something that's supposed to happen only once or in sequence is trying to happen simultaneously. So that may mean that something may get overwritten, may mean that something is happening in the wrong order. It's a serious problem. And replicating that in the real world can be very, very, very difficult. You could be a master system tester. Detecting a race condition is extraordinarily difficult. You can get the world's best hackers, get them together in the room. Finding a race condition is very difficult. However, if you have the source code, you could be a novice beginner programmer and you can spot that. You can be like, that's a race condition. That needs to be fixed. Well, maybe not necessarily a brand new guy, or new person, I should say, programmer, but still, it's something you can detect very early on with access to the source code. If you have access to only the binary, and you're doing only practical testing, then that's not very good because you can't necessarily detect it. So that first CNSC hearing I attended, they said, "Oh, well, we thoroughly test all of our codes. In fact, all of our software. In fact, we hire hackers to look at our software and run practical tests on it." And I heard that, I'm like, but that's not good enough. That's like practical testing. Yeah, that's important, but you need to actually also put out that source code for independent review. And then OPG's security expert, their chief of security, or whatever his term was, he said, "Oh, but if we give out access to the source code, then that in and of itself would be a security vulnerability." And I was like, really? Well, then how is it that OpenBSD, a Canadian open source software project that gives out its source code to everybody in the world so everybody can see it, it is used and trusted by the military, NASA, all these other organizations for security critical applications, and they're giving out their code for free? There was a documentary on, or it was like a show or something, made by, in high school, remember, like you have like a locker and there's like a combination lock, and you go out and typically the company, you typically see like Master Lock or Dudley Lock. Well, Dudley Lock, and there's all kinds of ways of hacking master locks, like those are almost notoriously bad. But Dudley, at least nobody I knew of at the time, however many years ago, I don't want to say how many years ago, but nobody knew how to crack a Dudley lock. Dudley actually made the segment on a television show where they showed you how they physically manufacture their combination locks. And they said that the only thing we're not going to tell you is how we come up with the number that we put on the inside. But this is what all the tumblers look like. This is how it all gets put together. And so in this case, we're going to use, let's say, this combination. Here's how we put it in, and they show how the machine does it. They put the whole thing together, and they said, there you go. Now let's see if you can crack it. They are so confident in the design of their lock that they are showing you how it's made. And you can look at it, you can take it apart. And it's a physical thing. Like you can physically take apart these locks and determine and try to determine on your own how you can take these things apart. With software, with binary, you just can't do it that easily. That is a practically impossible task.
And you need the exact same kind of computers that they're using with exactly the same IOs and devices that operate under its control. So it's probably not... You probably have to do a lot of thinking, I guess, to figure out how it would be a security vulnerability.
And I did give that a lot of thought. And I was like, well, wait a minute. So, and I thought about that between the hearings, and I was like, so let me get this straight. So they said previously, they told another intervener that all of their systems are completely isolated from the outside world. They said that all of their software is completely 100% isolated from the outside world. As a system administrator, I can tell you that is extraordinarily difficult to achieve. So I'm willing to believe it. My mind is open to the possibility that their systems truly are completely isolated from the outside world. So assuming what they're saying is true, then how can there be a vulnerability? There's a piece of privileged information that I had access to, and I wanted so badly to scream it at the top of my lungs. But I have a very strict privacy policy. I'm very sensitive and aware of a lot of security issues. When I was at that first hearing, I was trying to give them hints that I basically told them point blank, you need to stop using Microsoft Windows. But that should have given them some room to think about what they're also maybe doing in terms of their current structure, their current setup. Because one thing I was personally aware of, but I didn't want to say because it would betray people's trust, and I don't want to do that. I didn't want to be the person that would expose this to the world, because the thing that you do in the open source community is when you're aware of a security vulnerability, if you're a responsible person, you do responsible disclosure. So one of these issues came out in a publication there's like a think tank, like one of these big like think tank organizations called Chatham House, and they released a report in 2015, just like 2 months or maybe a month before CNSC's 2015 Darlington hearing, stating that at nuclear power plants around the world, they are using VPNs into protected areas. And this is something that I personally knew about, but I couldn't get across to them. Like, this is you have serious vulnerabilities. You need to not do that, because that is extraordinarily dangerous. What a VPN is it's a method of connecting from the outside world into what is supposed to be a secure area using what is supposed to be a secure form of communication. Now, that has all kinds of risks. There's a lot of risks involved with that. If the encryption method that you're using for your VPN tunnel has a vulnerability, if somebody discovers a vulnerability in that, then that's potentially compromised. If you're using weak encryption, that's a problem. If the system that you're using connects from the outside world, so like let's say you're doing this at home, if your home machine has a vulnerability, then that's a problem, because your home is almost certainly not a secure environment. You're not necessarily like this big Fort Knox type of a thing. So you have all of these other variables to consider. So the best, safest thing to do is not to do that. If you are working at a nuclear power plant, you should absolutely, under no circumstances, ever connect to a protected area from the outside world. Ever. Ever, ever, ever. Definitely not using a VPN. Never do that. You should have to physically go to the plant. Go through the physical security. People should have to look at you, study you, get biometrics, study your walking, everything. Do every layer of security you can think of to try to protect that protected area. That has to be paramount. This going in from your house, doing something that's potentially catastrophic, is very irresponsible. They should never have done it that way. And here Chatham House laid that out. They said it. They said nuclear power plants around the world are doing this. And they said that the reason why, and this is something I know from my own experience, is because there is an extreme disconnect between nuclear education and IT education. They just don't see eye to eye. So one thing that I have discovered is that as I learn more and more about nuclear people are starting to be like, okay, well, maybe he's actually serious and knowing what he's talking about. Same way the other way around, like as people who work in nuclear, as I try to educate them about this issue. And here's the crazy thing. I have had, I think 2, maybe 3 now, no, 2, only 2 so far. 2 OPG people come up to me privately and say, AJ, what is this source code issue that you're always talking about? And I explained it to them. And they understood it. I not right away, but I got them to understand it. And they were like, yeah, I guess I could see how that's an issue. But good luck. I'm not going to expose them. I'm not going to say who they were. But good luck getting them to go on the record. Because in the nuclear industry, you are either 100% wholeheartedly for the industry without question, or you are its biggest, most arch enemy. There is no gray area in between. So I personally don't see myself as anti-nuclear, because there's a lot of things that we do have good positive uses for nuclear technology that we just simply can't get otherwise. But nuclear power does not belong on this planet. It absolutely does not belong on this planet. It is bad, it is wrong, it is not what we should be using, especially not these terribly designed reactors that we're using. There's so many better, cheaper, cheap, and actually safe ways of generating electricity that we just don't need nuclear power. CNSC's Louise Levere could not receive the message that I was sending her through email. So what I wound up having to do, if I remember correctly, was upload it to a web server, call her, say, go to this URL, and you can download a copy of my intervention. And I was so floored that they would not just take my advice to fix this IT problem. And I mean, what I'm doing wasn't bad or wasn't nefarious. Like, there wasn't anything I'm doing wrong in this case. I was legitimately trying to help them fix a technical problem, and they weren't interested. I was just like, okay, I'm not trying to break into your system. In fact, like, I've given you the directions for how you can fix this. I'm not trying to install some remote backdoor on your computers. I'm not trying to do anything along those lines. You can take my instructions, my directions. You can give them to a security analyst. They'll look them over. They'll say, yeah, everything AJ is suggesting here is fine. He's not trying to break in, but they wouldn't do that. I'm offering this for free, and all the solutions I'm suggesting would have cost us taxpayers $0 to implement, other than whatever time that other than what salaries we're already paying these less than satisfactory IT professionals at CNSC. So how long did it take them to actually fix that problem, to buy that very expensive encryption add-on for that ridiculously obsolete email client? It took them 4 months. So just imagine 4 months. What if this had been an actual major crisis? 4 months. Like, this should not have taken 4 months. They had somebody there offering to help them for free, and yet it took them 4 months to fix this problem. I was mentioning earlier about that, the PDP-8. So that was a machine that was released in 1965. So it's a mini computer. So they released this thing in 1968, and they designed Pickering around that. So like those reactors that they're designing back around the time of Pickering was designed around the PDP-8. And so they would have software that they would run on the PDP-8. And then when Pickering was operational, what they actually put in there was the PDP-11. So instead of the 1965 computer, they put in the 1970 computer. What I find astonishing and shocking is that today, in 2017, they are continuing to use PDP-11 computers at Pickering. OPG has openly admitted this, that they are using PDP-11 computers at Pickering. So they're using, nearly 50-year-old computers, so 47-year-old computers at Pickering. Who owns a computer that is 47 years old that's not in a museum? Like, literally, I'm not exaggerating, there are actually museums looking for these computers, because most people threw them out decades ago, that want to have them as exhibits. I'm not exaggerating, that's actually a real thing. And they're continuing to use it. Why are they using it? Well, they will say, oh, well, they've been so reliable so far, and blah, blah, blah. But here's the thing. DEC is no longer even in business. You can't buy these components anymore. And yes, they are old enough that it's easier to manufacture parts than it is for modern machines, but these are still extremely expensive parts. I cannot, like, it's not an economical reason. There's no economical reason to continue using these things. That is wrong, in my opinion. Many, many tens of thousands of dollars that they spend on this stuff. It's been so reliable. Well, yes, as far as you know, but you don't know because you don't have access to all the code. That is a serious problem. If you did have access to the code, you can modify the code to make it work on modern hardware, and then you wouldn't be spending a bloody fortune on these really old, antiquated systems. So because they don't have access to the source code, they're spending a phenomenal amount of money, and because there's this huge disconnect between IT knowledge and nuclear knowledge, they're just not getting the message.
We're listed on Laughable, Stitcher, YouTube, Player FM, Google Play Music, Castbox, Blueberry, Listen Notes, Spotify, TuneIn, and iTunes.
In the nuclear industry, you're either completely with the industry or you're its arch enemy. They don't want to hear anything else. And a very classic example of that was a senior nuclear official in the United States. His name is Arnie Gundersen, Arnie Gundersen. I believe this is spelling.
And Fairwinds is spelt a little weird as well.
Yes, Fairwinds, so Fairewinds. That's his organization that he founded with him and his wife Maggie. And they're both extremely actively involved with this, and they publish such great stuff. But what happened to him because all he was doing is he was just raising a concern. He's like, there's a safety concern. I'm
It's
concerned.
my understanding he designed and maybe sold the racks that hold fuel rods.
Oh yeah, he was very
in the industry.
He was very, very deep in the industry and very high ranking. And he discovered an issue, he raised it, and the backlash, and I will leave it as an exercise to the reader to look up what this guy and what he and his wife have endured as a backlash. But it's very, very shocking what has happened to them because of it. But there are a few things that I want people to take a look at. A couple of videos that were done by them. One is it's a video on Vimeo, and it may also be on YouTube, but on Vimeo it is Vimeo, in case you haven't heard it before. The video is 18 minutes and 58 seconds long. The title of the video is 40 Years of Being a Good Neighbor. And it was published by it was posted by Fairwinds, and it was a recording from CNSC's 2013 Pickering hearing. And Arnie Gunderson was brought in there as an intervener, as an invited guest. Durham Nuclear Awareness got funding from CNSC to bring in an expert about what they wanted to talk about. And so DNA hired Arnie Gunderson to come up here and give this amazing intervention. And I highly recommend everyone watch it. It's only 19 minutes, 18 minutes and 58 seconds. Again, the title is 40 Years of Being a Good Neighbor. The second video from Arnie Gunderson that everybody should absolutely watch, and it's a good one. It's a long one. It's 29 minutes long. Well, 29 minutes and 54 seconds. It's also on Vimeo. It may also be on YouTube. But the title of the video is CO2 Smoke Screen: New Nukes Make Global Warming Worse. So, CO2 Smoke Screen: New Nukes Make Global Warming Worse. It is amazing. Check it out. Anytime you hear the argument of, oh, we need nuclear because of CO2, this debunks it in the most amazing way that I have ever seen. You have to check it out. What's happened to Arnie is appalling, but he's not the only one. And what I find endlessly fascinating is how many people who used to work in the industry are now coming out to speak against it. And here in Ontario, we've had two really awesome cases of it. And one of the most famous in Ontario would be Frank Greening. Frank Greening is an OPG, or retired OPG scientist, who discovered, well, that's a whole other discussion, but basically the industry now treats him very, very badly. He came out raising an issue, serious, legitimate, look it up yourself, it's a real issue, and they totally have tried to destroy him because of that, just trying to discredit everything that he does, everything that he says, and just, they're not willing to admit that they've made a mistake. And the more recent example of that was, at least in my case, I never heard of him until the 2015 hearing, but Sunil Najawan, I should say. He came to the hearing with this approach of, look, there are problems, but we can fix them. And so he wasn't even saying, like, this is a problem, let's all, let's all freak out. He was saying, no, here's how we can actually fix these problems. And it was such a different take. And I'm sure that, like, Arnie and Frank, I'm positive that they probably did that a million times over. But for me, it was the first time I'd ever actually seen that from somebody at a hearing. Mind you, the only hearings, I'll be honest, the only hearings I've really watched have been the Pickering and Darlington hearings, because they're so close to Toronto. And I care a lot about Toronto, so this is like most of my work, and everything is here, so I gotta look after it. Yeah, they've treated these two people very, very badly. And what's amazing is that after that hearing, I went up to him. I went up to Sunil before I went up to give my intervention to introduce myself and to ask him some questions about some things that he raised. And I was so floored by how friendly he is. First off, he's crazy smart, but he's also very, 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 very friendly. And I'm talking to him at the hearing, and at one point, People are going outside, and I go outside. I'm talking with them, and I'm out there, and I'm asking him these questions, and then somebody from CNSC walks up to him, and this person from CNSC comes up to him and says, "Hi, how do we pronounce your last name?" And Sunil's like, "It doesn't matter. I don't care how you pronounce my last name. My name isn't the issue. These are the problems. I want you to see that these are problems, fix these problems. This is what I'm here to talk about. Who I am, what I do, all of me is not important. What's important are these issues. These issues have to be fixed, and we can fix them." So it's such a different way of looking at things. I had to be clear that it's not just simply, let's just bash the industry. There are people that are actually looking at this constructively, like, what can we do to make a lot of these problems go away?
And if you're really cynical and you realize no matter what, no matter how much it costs, no matter how much waste, no matter how many people speak out against it, it's still going to go on. So actually one strategy might be to try to improve it.
I think he's kind of realized now that that's not their intention. But I'm not really sure. I'm not Sunil, so I don't want to speak for him. But it's an industry that definitely needs to die. I don't hold back from saying that. So I want everybody who can to please come to the January DNHC meeting. OFMEM is going to be there. The Office of the Foreign Marshal and Emergency Management in Ontario is going to be there. DEMO, Durham Emergency Management Office is going to be there. You'll get to see what those people are like. Of course, OPG is going to be there. And you can get to interact with the people who are actually involved in making the decisions for what to do in the event of a major disaster. So everybody should come there and just ask questions, because you actually get to ask questions of these people at these meetings. The CNSC guy was totally convinced that the email message I'd sent him was encrypted. Now, I assure you that I definitely did not encrypt this message, but he didn't believe that. So what I did is I said, okay, here's what I want you to do. I want you to just save a copy of that message to your computer. Let's factor out the email client in this case. Let's save a copy of that message to your computer and now open it. Okay, now I got him to do that, and he went along with it, and he opened up the message, and then he read me the message that I wrote. So clearly it was not an encrypted message. He didn't understand this. I had to explain to him, like, this is a digital signature. You'll notice there's the clear text, and then there's the digital signature below that. The signature basically has a hash of the message. But he didn't get that. And I'm thinking, okay, wait, so this is CNSC's IT department. So this is the IT department for Canada's federal nuclear regulator, and I'm having to explain to them the differences between encrypted messages and digitally signed messages. This is basic stuff. How come they don't know this?
Listen online and find our contact information on our webpage, tmi.twxnet.com.
All right, so I guess just some last things I'll say is immediately just hear what I'm about to say and then pause and then do this. Please do this immediately. If you are in the GTA, the Greater Toronto Area, if you're in Toronto, if you are in, especially if you're in Durham region, if you're in York region, and you can even try it if you're in Peel region as well, and also Northumberland County. Maybe even Simcoe County, I'm wondering. Go to preparetobesafe.ca/order and order your potassium iodide tablets. It'll ask you to punch in your postal code or something. And if you're eligible, if you're within 50 kilometers, great. You may not be eligible, that's one possibility. But you should at the very least try it, especially if you're in Toronto, especially if you're in Durham region. You have to have those potassium iodide pills in the event of a nuclear disaster. So just hit pause now and go do that. And then I'll continue. So I've assumed you stop pausing now, so I'll keep talking. So if you want, you can come to the November DNHC meeting, Durham Nuclear Health Committee meeting. It takes place in Whitby, Ontario at 605 Rosalind Road East in Meeting Room LLC. It's on November 17th, 2017. It starts at 1 p.m. And again, it's not a committee you should be really taking seriously, but there's a lot of important information that comes up at these meetings, and you can actually meet some of the interesting people that attend. So you'll find that some of the fun people, in fact, seemingly probably all the fun people, are the people who attend as observers, and the people who are actually there to do organize and run the committee, and most of the presenters, because they don't want people who are critical of the industry to be giving presentations. They don't want them to be giving presentations. So pretty much all the presenters are all very, very, very in the industry's pockets. But there's going to be a meeting, and CNSC is going to be there, and a few other people are going to be there. Maybe worth attending. But the important one at the same place, so again, Durham Regional Headquarters at 605 Rosalind Road East. Rosalind Road East, I should emphasize East, because there's also a West, I think. But make sure you go to 605 Rosalind Road East in town of Whitby, Meeting Room LLC, at 1 p.m. on January 19th. Very important. Please, please, please come to the nuclear emergency planning meeting. Very important. We need people to talk, listen, ask questions, and you can meet some of the really cool, awesome people who do good work on that subject. I'm very confident Teresa McClanahan will be there. Very confident Sean Patrick Stensel will be there. DNA, Durham Nuclear Awareness, of course they will be there. You can meet those people. So it's definitely worth doing. So if maybe you'll learn something, but worst case scenario, you get to meet some really fun people. And then I guess the last thing I really want to say to people is just start talking to people about these issues. It doesn't matter who. Talk to your neighbor, your friend. If you're in line at the grocery store and they're waiting for somebody to do a price check, just talk with the cashier. Doesn't matter. Just talk to people. Talk to your family, talk to your friends, get some practice with it, and just talk and hear their feedback, because, and we'll have to talk about this next time, but I have some what I consider to be very interesting stories from people that I've talked to from my own experience, and your own stories are probably going to be even far more experienced because of hopefully there's more people listening to this. And so that's all I want to say.
AJ, the IT professional from Ontario. Your return visit. Thank you very much.
Thank you again for having me.
And all this stuff to Google and read up on and look into.
And I really hope that more people listen to this and want to give their own takes, be it an expert take, which would be great, or even just your own personal take on the matter, because so many people have stories and everybody has their own unique takes on the matter. You may have some really interesting things to say.
I'm Dave Archer from Toronto.
And I'm AJ, the IT professional from Ontario.